A battered German shepherd stood outside a small-town coffee shop, silent in the cold Michigan light, his fur stained with mud, smoke, and the sorrow of a broken home. He did not beg for food. He looked through the glass at one young FBI agent as if her face was the last door Mercy had left open. Behind those weary eyes waited a ruined man, stolen land, and a truth buried beneath promises of progress. If you believe God still uses the forgotten to lead us to what must be saved, leave Amen. Lila Mercer had not wanted to come back to Morro Bay in winter, even if winter here was gentler than the brutal white silences farther north. At 28, she had already learned that rest could feel more exhausting than work when the mind refused to loosen its grip. She was a special agent with the FBI, but the badge was tucked away in her coat pocket that morning, hidden like a private wound. Her supervisor had called this trip mandatory leave. Her Aunt Ruth, who lived in a weathered blue cottage a few miles outside town, had called it common sense. Lila, tall and spare with chestnut brown hair pulled into a low knot and gray-blue eyes that missed very little, had called it nothing at all. She had simply driven up from Detroit the day before, shoulders tight, jaw set, carrying the sort of quiet that made kind people ask fewer questions. Harbor Pine Coffee stood on a bright corner of Main Street with wide front windows that caught the pale gold of late winter sunlight. Inside, the place smelled of espresso, cinnamon, and old wood, warmed by the heater near the counter. The tables were mismatched in a way that tried a little too hard to look charming, but the charm still worked. Lila sat by the glass with a black coffee she had barely touched. Her back was angled toward the wall by instinct, not fear. Across from her, a young barista with freckles and a straw-colored braid moved between the register and the espresso machine. Her name tag read Mara, and she had the brisk, capable energy of someone who had learned early that small-town politeness ran better on efficiency than on sweetness. Outside, Morro Bay looked almost innocent. The sidewalks were edged with old snow, grayed at the curb but clean where the morning light touched it. A church steeple rose over the neighboring block. A hardware store sign creaked in the wind. Everything had that washed, bright clarity that northern towns wore after a cold night, when the world looked scrubbed but not healed. Lila watched a bundled-up couple pass with paper bags under their arms and thought, not for the first time, that some places were beautiful in the same way certain lies were beautiful. Smooth on the surface, expensive with silence underneath. Then she saw the dog. He came from the far end of the street slowly, almost carefully, as if each step had to be negotiated with his body before it could be trusted. He was a German shepherd, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, large-framed but worn thin, with a sable coat dulled by dirt and weather. One ear held upright while the other bent at the tip. His ribs showed faintly beneath the fur. His rear leg was stiff enough to give him a slight hitch in his gait. There was nothing wild in him, no frantic darting, no scavenger's desperation. He did not stop at the trash can by the curb. He did not approach the family leaving the bakery. He walked until he reached the stretch of glass in front of Lila's table, and then he stood there. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He just looked in. His eyes were amber brown, tired but steady, and there was something almost unbearable in the way he held them on her face, as if he had run out of language long ago and had come with only one thing left: hope. Mara noticed him a moment later and sighed. "Poor thing," she muttered, then glanced toward the door with the practical worry of someone already picturing health code trouble. Another customer, an older man in a green hunting cap, frowned and said, "Stray ought to keep moving. That kind always brings fleas." The sentence hung in the warm café air like a sour note. Lila did not answer. She kept looking at the dog, and the dog kept looking at her. A delivery truck thundered over a patch of frozen slush outside, and the sudden spray of dirty ice slapped the window with a sharp crack. The dog flinched, one paw lifting off the sidewalk for half a heartbeat. Then he steadied himself and looked back at Lila, as if the world had already thrown harder things at him and he had no time left for fear. Something in her chest tightened. Not pity exactly. Recognition, perhaps. Not of the dog himself, but of that exhausted refusal to fall apart in public. She rose before she had fully decided to do it. The bell above the café door gave a soft chime as she stepped into the cold. The dog did not back away. Up close, he smelled of damp fur, smoke, stale alcohol, and the sour, cramped odor of someone's makeshift shelter. There was an old pressure mark circling the thick fur of his neck, not raw now, but faded into the coat, the memory of a collar worn for a long time. His body trembled with fatigue more than fear. Lila crouched a few feet away, careful not to crowd him. "Hey," she said softly. His ears shifted. His expression changed in the smallest way, as if the sound of a gentle voice had reached a room inside him that had nearly gone dark. Lila went back into the cafe, bought a plain turkey sandwich and a paper cup of water, then returned outside. She tore the sandwich into pieces and set them down one by one on the cleared patch of sidewalk. The dog lowered his head, then stopped. He looked at the food, then at her. He waited. That was what caught her. Not a trick, not obedience sharpened into performance. Just the quiet habit of a dog who had once belonged somewhere, who had once been spoken to kindly enough that permission still mattered. "It's okay," Lila said, lowering her voice even more. "Go ahead." Only then did he eat. He did not gulp. He took the food carefully, almost politely, though hunger trembled through him like a second pulse. When he finished, he drank some water, then stood again, not trying to lean against her, not pressing for more, just standing near. An hour later, she was driving him to Naomi Bell's clinic on the edge of town. Dr. Naomi Bell was 43, broad-shouldered and practical, with deep brown skin, close-cropped curls, and the composed hands of a woman who had spent years mending creatures who could not explain where it hurt. She had grown up on a dairy farm outside Traverse City, and had the plain-spoken steadiness of people who trusted labor more than drama. Naomi examined the dog with professional gentleness, speaking low the whole time. "He's underweight, exhausted, bruised around the flank, old strain in the back leg," she said. "Nothing here says he's feral." She scanned his registration tag number from the worn buckle on the collar remnant Naomi had worked free from the fur. A record came up. "Shep," Naomi read quietly. "Owner, Caleb Dunn." The name meant nothing to Lila. It meant something to Naomi. The doctor's face changed, not into suspicion, but into that grave softness people wore around stories they wished had ended differently. She told Lila that Caleb Dunn had once been one of the good men in Merrill Bay, a farm equipment mechanic, broad-handed, patient, the kind who fixed neighbors' engines on Sundays and never sent a bill if he knew they were struggling. He had raised Shep from a pup on family land by the bay. Then came Bay Point Renewal District, land seizure, court papers, promises of development. Caleb lost the house his father had built a porch onto with his own hands, lost the workshop, lost his marriage not long after. Somewhere under all of that, Naomi said, he had started drinking too much. Not evil, just broken in the ordinary American way, slowly, publicly, and with nobody powerful enough to care. "He's been rough with the dog?" Lila asked. Naomi sighed. "Neglect, mostly. Shouting, shoving when he's deep in the bottle. A couple of people heard things they didn't like. Enough that I'll be calling animal control today." She set a hand lightly on Shep's shoulder. "But this dog still belongs to a life that didn't start cruel." Lila nodded. The distinction mattered more than she wanted it to. When Shep had been cleaned enough to show the richer brown beneath the grime and settled with a blanket in a treatment kennel, Lila left the clinic and drove toward the bay. Naomi had given her directions to the old Dunn property. She found it at the edge of a dead-end road where the winter grass lay flat under a crust of light frost. The house was gone. Only the broken outline of a foundation remained, half buried under dirt and weeds. A weather-faded sign still leaned crooked near the roadside, Bay Point Renewal District, a brighter future for Morro Bay. Behind it stretched raw, empty land and silence. Lila sat in the idling car and looked at what was left. It was not just vacant ground. It was the shape of something taken and never replaced. By the time she returned to Naomi's clinic, the daylight had begun to thin. Shep was supposed to be resting. Instead, when she entered the treatment room, he pushed himself upright on shaky legs. His eyes found her at once. He tried to step forward, favoring his sore hind leg, but still trying, as if whatever had brought him to the glass that morning had not yet finished speaking. And Lila, standing in the small warm room with the smell of antiseptic and wet fur around her, understood one thing with sudden, quiet certainty. This dog had not come out of nowhere. He had come out of ruins. The next morning came to Morro Bay wrapped in a pale silver light that made every rooftop look gentler than it truly was. Lila Mercer woke in her aunt's cottage to the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the smell of toast she did not want. Her Aunt Ruth believed in feeding sorrow before it could settle in the bones. She was 72, small and upright, with soft white hair pinned at the back of her head and the kind of lined face that looked kind even in silence. Widowhood had turned her quieter, not colder. She moved through her kitchen with the same careful grace she used when speaking to wounded people, as though all grief might spill if set down too fast. "You slept at all?" she asked, sliding a plate toward Lila. Lila, who had slept in fragments and old reflexes, answered with a shrug that was meant to be lighter than it felt. She kept thinking about the dog, about the way Shep had tried to rise when she came back into Naomi Bell's clinic, though pain had clearly tugged at every step. Dogs did not lie the way people did. They could fear, resist, submit, cling, or love, but they did not rearrange the truth to make themselves easier to bear. That was one reason Lila had always trusted them more than she admitted. By the time she left Ruth's house, the sky had sharpened into a hard northern blue, and the bay beyond the trees shone with a cold brightness that made the world look almost newly made. She stopped first at the town records office, a low brick building with a flag out front and a heater that groaned like an old man in prayer. The woman at the desk introduced herself as Jean Holloway, a county clerk with iron-gray curls and half-moon glasses perched low on her nose. Jean was round-faced and neat, the sort of woman who had filed 30 years of human trouble into manila folders and come away believing that paper was only slightly more honest than memory. She spoke politely, but her eyes sharpened when Lila mentioned Bay Point Renewal District. "That land business left a bad taste here," Jean said, lowering her voice as though the walls might still be listening. "People fought, neighbors stopped waving, families split over it. All for a brighter future nobody can seem to find." Lila spent the next hour reading through public records, notices of acquisition, rezoning language, financial summaries filled with cheerful phrases like community growth and waterfront revitalization. The words were clean, too clean. Buried between them were references to infrastructure grants, tax incentives, and federal redevelopment support. Enough, at least, to make fraud more than a local embarrassment if the money had been moved dishonestly. She copied down the names of firms and committees, then sat back and stared at a page that claimed the done parcel had been necessary to improve long-term public benefit. Public benefit. The phrase sat on the page like polished silver over an empty table. At midday, she drove to Naomi's clinic. Shep was resting in a kennel under a folded blanket, one great sable paw stretched into the light. Cleaned up, he looked both better and sadder. Dirt had disguised how handsome he once had been. He was around 5 years old, Naomi guessed, with the long, intelligent face of a well-bred shepherd, a deep chest now thinned by neglect, and thick fur that would have been beautiful if it had not been dulled by hard weeks and careless hands. When he saw Lila, his ears lifted. He did not whine or leap. He only stood and held her gaze, restrained even in need. Naomi leaned against the counter with a file in one hand. "I called animal control," she said. "They'll want documentation before any permanent action. Bruising, malnourishment, instability in the owner's home, witness reports. It takes time." She gave Lila a look both practical and tired. The law likes to walk when pain is already running. "What do you know about Caleb?" Lila asked. Naomi exhaled through her nose. Enough to wish the story had stopped halfway through. She told it plainly. Caleb Dunn had once been the man people called when an engine failed in planting season. He was 43 now, broad in the shoulders under all the ruin, with dark hair gone uneven at the temples, and a rough beard he used to keep trimmed when life still obeyed ordinary rules. He had inherited the bay property from his father. He repaired the porch himself, reset fence posts after storms, planted lilac bushes for his wife, and raised Shep from a clumsy-eared puppy who used to sleep in a tool crate beside the workshop heater. He wasn't flashy, Naomi said. Just decent. Those are usually the people who shatter the quietest. Lila felt that sentence settle somewhere deep. She had seen ambitious men survive disgrace, charming men survive betrayal, selfish men survive almost anything. But decent people often broke from losses they had never trained themselves to expect. A metal tray slipped from the edge of Naomi's exam table and struck the floor with a bright, shivering crash. Shep startled upright inside the kennel, then froze, ears high, eyes on the doorway instead of the sound, as if every sudden noise still had to be measured for what it might take from him next. Naomi stooped, picked up the tray, and gave Shep an apologetic glance. "That right there," she said softly. "That's not the behavior of a wild dog. That's a dog from a home where noise used to mean something." Lila left the clinic with a copy of the intake report and drove to the trailer park Naomi had mentioned, a weary little strip of gravel lots on the edge of town where the lake wind had nowhere kind to go. Caleb's trailer sat near the back beside a leaning chain-link fence. One tire was half sunk in mud, and the steps up to the door had been repaired with 2 different kinds of wood, both weathered gray. The place looked less like a residence than a compromise someone had stopped defending. A woman from the next lot was outside hanging laundry that would never dry properly in that cold. She introduced herself as Doreen Pike, tall and bony with nicotine-yellowed fingers, dyed auburn hair pinned loosely under a scarf, and the watchful face of someone who knew every sorrow within shouting distance. She spoke without malice, but without softness either. "Caleb used to smile," she said, clipping a shirt to the line. "That's how you know he's gone bad, not by the bottle. Men can drink and still be themselves. But when they stop smiling at dogs and children, that's when something deeper has caved in." She glanced toward the trailer. "He yells at Shep some nights, pushes him around. Then other nights he sits on those steps till dawn, crying into his coat while the dog lies there beside him like some poor old saint." Lila thanked her and knocked. It took a long time for the door to open. When it finally did, Caleb Dunn stood there wearing a thermal shirt under an old canvas jacket, both wrinkled and stained as if he had slept in them 3 winters straight. Up close he was bigger than she expected, the width of a man built for labor rather than show. His face might once have been plainly handsome, strong jaw, straight nose, deep-set blue eyes, but neglect had roughened all of it. His beard had gone uneven, his mouth carried the bitterness of someone who no longer believed in good faith, and his eyes were red-rimmed with poor sleep and too much drink. Yet under the exhaustion there was still an outline of the man Naomi had described. That was the worst part. Ruin is always sadder when dignity still flickers beneath it. "What do you want?" he asked, voice hoarse but not loud. Lila introduced herself only as Lila Mercer and told him she had found Shep outside Harbor Pine and taken him to the vet. At the dog's name, something moved in Caleb's face. Not relief, not exactly shame. More like a door in a storm trying to decide whether it could bear opening. "He alive?" he asked. "Yes." Caleb looked past her shoulder toward the road, then stepped back enough for her to see into the trailer. The interior smelled of old coffee, damp wool, gasoline, and the stale edge of beer. On the small table lay a folded zoning map, a burned paper box, and several crumpled letters held down by an ashtray. Lila's eyes moved there by instinct. Caleb saw it and changed instantly. His shoulders hardened. "Don't," he said. It was such a raw word that she almost missed the fear under it. "I'm not here for your papers," she said. "That's what they all say before they take something." His laugh was brief and joyless. "Town took my land. Bank took the rest. Court took time I didn't have. You here for the dog, or to tell me how I failed him too?" Lila did not answer quickly. People often lied to protect themselves from blame. Caleb, she sensed, spoke to keep blame where he could still see it. That was different. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. She stepped away and answered. Naomi's voice came low and careful. "One of the old holdouts from Bay Point," she said. "Man named Walter Baines. He was found this morning at his sister's place. They're saying he fell down the cellar steps." Lila looked back at Caleb standing in the half-open trailer doorway, one hand gripping the frame hard enough to whiten his knuckles. The zoning map behind him fluttered once in the heater draft like something trying to breathe. A dead opponent. A ruined homeowner. A dog that had walked through town until it found the one face that did not send it away. When she hung up, Caleb had lowered his eyes. "Shep still eat gentle?" he asked, almost too quietly to hear. "Yes," Lila said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that moment he looked less dangerous than undone. "He always waited," he murmured, "even when he was little." That was the first true thing he had given her. Leila left without pushing further. As she drove away, the trailer grew small in her mirror, bent under the bright afternoon light, like a man refusing to fall in public. She understood something now that she had not fully understood the day before. Shep had not merely wandered into her path. He had come carrying the faint, faithful thread of a life that had once been orderly and loving, and that thread led straight to Caleb Dunn, a man broken enough to frighten people, but perhaps not so broken that the truth had left him. By the third morning, Marrow Bay no longer felt like a town Lila Mercer had merely returned to. It felt like a place that had begun to look back at her. The cold had softened a little overnight, and the snow along Main Street sagged at the edges like old lace left in sunlight. She drove first to the north side of town, where retired reporter Edith Rowe lived in a narrow white house with green shutters and a front porch crowded with sleeping flower pots. Edith was 76, tall in the way some elderly women remain tall by pure force of will, with silver hair cut to her jaw and skin lined fine as folded paper. Her eyes were bright and unsentimental. Years in local journalism had given her a voice that could sound warm and skeptical at the same time, and the collapse of Bay Point had left a permanent flint edge in her. She had once believed that if a thing was documented clearly enough, decency would eventually win. Age had not made her cynical so much as careful about how much faith she spent. She received Lila in a living room full of books, file boxes, and a tabby cat old enough to have stopped pretending to care about visitors. The cat, Biscuit, was a heavy orange creature with torn ears, sleepy gold eyes, and the expression of someone who had survived many winters and thought them all mildly inconvenient. Edith poured tea into a chipped blue mug for Lila and set a cardboard archive box on the coffee table with both hands, almost ceremonially. "I should have pushed harder," she said, resting her long fingers on the lid. That's one of the curses of growing old. You collect not just memories, but drafts of courage you wish you'd mailed sooner. Inside the box were council minutes, rezoning notices, printouts from shell companies, and scribbled notes from residents who had fought the land seizure. There were copies of unsigned letters warning holdouts to stop embarrassing the town, and photographs of heavy vehicles moving across the Dunn property weeks after the place was supposed to be sealed. Caleb took some of these, Edith said, sliding one toward Lila. It showed a pair of trucks at the bay after midnight, headlights off, the water black as hammered metal behind them. He still had fight in him then, not much polish, but plenty of moral muscle. He came to me angry, not broken. Lila studied the photo. One truck bore a temporary municipal permit. The other had its company markings covered with a tarp. "And Walter Baines?" she asked. Edith's face grew still. "Walter was supposed to bring me a copy of something 3 days ago. He called just before sunset, said he finally understood why Bay Point had needed the Dunn parcel and the old maintenance corridor near the shore. Said if anything happened to him, I was to tell someone federal, not local." Her mouth tightened. The next morning he was dead at his sister's house, and everyone was suddenly very eager to call him clumsy. That sat with Lila all the way back across town. It was one thing to suspect greed. It was another to feel the shape of fear moving under it. She stopped at Naomi's clinic before returning to Caleb's trailer. Shep was stronger already, though not by much. Clean fur had begun to soften over his back, and his eyes followed Lila with the steadiness of a dog who had decided she belonged to the map now. Naomi handed over a photocopy of the intake report and lowered her voice. "Animal control is moving carefully. Caleb's prior record is light, and the town doesn't like paperwork that leads to court. I can hold Shep a little longer on medical grounds, but not forever." Lila crouched beside the kennel. Shep rose, stretched carefully, then pressed his nose once against the wire. "I'm going back," she murmured. "You know that, don't you?" His ears tipped forward, and for one strange moment she had the sense that the dog did not simply want to be understood. He wanted something remembered. The trailer park looked even more tired in afternoon light. The gravel road was damp from melt, and plastic lawn chairs leaned drunkenly beside 2 neighboring lots. Caleb opened the door more quickly this time, which was not the same as welcoming her. He looked worse. His beard had gone darker with sweat and neglect, his broad face hollowed by a night without proper rest, and his eyes carried that pale red rim of a man who had bargained with sleep and lost. Yet there was less alcohol on him than before. That Lila noticed and filed away. "What now?" he asked, voice rough. "I spoke with Edith Rowe." Something flinched behind his expression. She stepped just inside the trailer. The same zoning map sat folded on the table. The burned paper box remained where it had been, but now there was a tension in the air, as if the room itself knew it was being cornered. Caleb rubbed one hand over his mouth and looked toward the floor before he meant to. "Should have burned the whole lot," he muttered. "The whole what?" Lila asked gently. He laughed once without humor, then reached for a mug that held only stale coffee. "Nothing, just old paper." He turned away, and in turning he said it, soft, careless, half to himself. "Box under the floor ought to have gone first." He froze after the words came out. So did Lila. At that exact instant, a loose pane somewhere in the trailer wall snapped in the wind with a sharp clap, and the sound cut through the silence like a hand striking wood. Caleb jerked his head toward it, but the moment had already broken open. The truth was in the room now, bright and impossible to put back. Lila did not move fast. Fast would have felt like theft. "Caleb," she said, "I'm not here to strip what's left off your life, but if Walter Baines died because he tried to tell the truth, then this is bigger than your pride." His shoulders sagged in a way that made him look older than 43. Shame has weight. It changes the shape of a man before it changes his choices. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the warped linoleum. "I took pictures because I thought somebody would care," he said. Then, every week after that, fewer people did. At the mention of the bed, Shep, who had waited outside in Lila's car but now stood just inside the trailer door on a short lead, moved forward. He was alert without tension, watching Caleb with that aching combination of caution and loyalty only dogs seem able to carry. He sniffed near the frame, then scratched once, lightly, at a loose plank near the wall. Caleb gave a tired, wounded smile so brief it was almost a memory. "He used to watch me hide things there," he murmured. "Smart fool." Lila knelt, pried up the board, and found a narrow recess beneath it. Inside sat a small metal box, spotted with rust, but still intact. Someone had wrapped the contents carefully. Photographs, handwritten plate numbers, folded council notices with red marks in the margins, 2 letters from a man named Tom Arlen, and a USB drive sealed in a little waterproof bag. Tom, one letter revealed, had been Caleb's friend since high school, a former dock worker with a thick neck and a stubborn sense of fairness who had begun tracking unusual shipments along the Bay Road before his death the year prior officially ruled a suicide. The word felt thin on the page. Lila took the box back to Edith's house to use her old desktop computer, a machine slow enough to hum before it obeyed, but sturdy as a farm truck. The USB opened at last. Spreadsheets, routing notes, temporary land use permits, payment chains through companies with polished names and no real faces. One file made the room go very quiet. After the seizures, part of the waterfront had been redesignated for Temporary Logistics Support Services, a bland phrase broad enough to hide warehousing, staging, and late-night movement of unlisted materials. Edith read over Lila's shoulder, her hand going still on the desk. "There it is," she whispered. "They didn't just take the land. They changed its purpose in language plain enough to pass and vague enough to conceal." Lila thought of Caleb standing in that dim trailer, too wounded to save himself, but still somehow having saved this. Thought of Shep, waiting years inside one ruined loyalty and one ruined home. Bay Point was no longer just a cruel development story with a legal smile. It was beginning to look like a cover, financial, logistical, and deliberate. And now, for the first time since arriving in Morro Bay, Lila no longer felt like a woman on leave. She felt like an agent standing at the edge of something that had already taken too much. By late afternoon, the light over Morro Bay had turned the color of cold brass, bright and unforgiving, the kind that made every boarded window and every rust stain show its age. Lila Mercer drove from Edith Rowe's house with the copied files beside her, and a low ache behind her eyes that had nothing to do with a lack of sleep. The USB data was no longer just a thread of suspicion. It was a pattern, and patterns were what made her dangerous when she was at her best. But this was no longer the kind of work she could do alone, not if she wanted it to hold up in daylight. So she made the call Naomi had quietly suggested the night before. Deputy Sheriff Mara Quinn met her outside the county substation just as the wind began to rise off the bay. Mara was 53, tall and lean with the rangy build of a woman who had spent more years in boots than in comfort. Her hair, once auburn, had faded into a dry copper gray she kept braided tight down her back. Her face was angular and weather-burnished, with narrow green eyes that looked as if they had learned long ago not to trust easy explanations. She had grown up in Morro Bay, left to work road patrol in 2 larger counties, then returned after her husband's heart gave out on a fishing dock 6 winters earlier. Grief had not softened her. It had stripped her down to the useful parts. She listened to Lila's summary without interruption, one gloved hand resting on her belt, the other wrapped around a paper cup of gas station coffee gone lukewarm. "Bay Point split this town like an axe through wet wood," she said. "Half the people still call it bad luck. The other half call it theft. I call it paperwork with a nicer haircut." Together they ran the plate numbers from Caleb's old photographs through local access points Mara could legally touch faster than Lila could. 2 came back to a subcontractor that had done shoreline stabilization work during the early Bay Point phase. Another pointed toward a logistics company that had dissolved 3 years ago but still appeared in vendor records connected to temporary storage contracts. The names kept circling the same drained patch of waterfront like gulls over something dead. Mara tapped one line with a blunt finger. "This one," she said, "Rivermark Haulage. They were supposed to be clearing debris. Never made sense to me why debris needed late-night runs." Before they could go farther, Naomi called. Her voice was steady, but Lila could hear the tension beneath it. Caleb had knocked over a kerosene heater in his trailer the night before during a drunken stumble. Not a deliberate act, Naomi believed, just a man too full of grief and alcohol to trust his own feet. A neighbor had smelled smoke. Shep, who had been there on a temporary observation visit approved before the paperwork fully tightened, had started barking hard enough to bring Doreen Pike pounding on the trailer door. The heater had scorched a patch of flooring and singed the edge of a blanket. Shep had a minor burn along one shoulder from brushing too close while trying to herd Caleb back from the heat. "It was enough," Naomi said quietly. Animal Control filed a formal risk note this morning. Temporary suspension of ownership pending review. Caleb signed because he was too ashamed not to. She paused. He kept asking if the dog was all right before he asked about the trailer. Lila closed her eyes for a moment. Shame again. Shame everywhere. And Shep? Tired, sore, still watching every door. An hour later, Lila and Mara drove to Naomi's clinic. Shep came out wearing a borrowed nylon leash and a fresh bandage at his shoulder, his heavy sable coat lifting in the wind. Clean, he looked even more heartbreakingly domestic. 5 years old at most, broad-headed, amber-eyed, built to be a proud house dog, not a drifter between ruins. He walked carefully but without complaint, glancing once toward the parking lot as if checking whether someone was missing from the map. Lila opened the back of her SUV, and he climbed in after a small hesitation. She thought they were heading back toward town. Then they passed the road that curved toward the old Dunn property. Shep rose immediately. His ears came forward, his nose lifted. A low, strained sound left him. Not a growl, not fear, but a kind of urgent recognition. He planted his front paws against the rear seat and stared toward the left side of the road, where winter grass lay flattened around the abandoned Bay Point lots. "He smells something," Mara said. "No," Lila murmured, watching the dog's body tighten. "He remembers something?" She pulled over near the bent project sign. The air outside smelled of wet soil, salt off the bay, and something else, faint, chemical, recent. Shep jumped down, tugged once, then moved with surprising certainty across the broken edge of what had once been Caleb's front yard. He was not tracking like a trained dog. He was following layers of old belonging, fence line, porch line, workshop corner, then beyond that, toward the half-finished foundation where developers had cut into the earth and never bothered to heal it. A sheet of loose corrugated metal somewhere ahead slammed sharply in the wind, and the sound split the open land like a rifle crack. Shep stopped at once, every muscle rigid, one paw lifted, his gaze locked on a patch of collapsed concrete where the sunlight flashed briefly off something wet and dark beneath it. For one suspended beat, the whole bay seemed to hold its breath with him. Mara was already on her radio, calling for backup and logging possible unlawful site activity. "I've got fresh tire impressions," she said, crouching near the mud. "Not from last week. Today, maybe last night." Lila smelled gasoline now, unmistakable and recent. There were drag marks, too, as if boxes or crates had been shifted across gravel. This was enough. Not proof of the whole machine, but enough reason not to stand back and let someone erase it. They crossed the broken slab together. Near the far side of the foundation, hidden beneath warped plywood and winter weeds, was a recessed hatch half covered in construction mesh. Not a secret bunker. Something older and more ordinary, a maintenance cellar from before the redevelopment, likely used once for service access or shoreline utility controls. The kind of practical structure no one romanticized and everyone forgot. Someone had remembered it recently. Mara hauled the hatch open with a grunt. Stale air rose out, thick with damp concrete, fuel, and mold. Lila clicked on her flashlight and descended first. The beam cut across stacked pallets, plastic-wrapped containers, and a folding table with clipboards left behind in haste. There were transfer manifests, partial title records, torn seal tags, and a narrow ledger tracking incoming loads marked only with code numbers and Bayside dates. It was not elegant criminal genius. It was business filth, organized enough to profit, lazy enough to believe no one decent would look under the floorboards of a dead project. Shep remained at the top of the steps for a few seconds, whining low through his nose, then barked once, sharp, commanding, toward the open hatch behind them. Mara's head snapped up. "Vehicle!" They heard it then, gravel popping under tires, engine idling too slow. Lila moved fast, grabbing the thickest folder, the ledger, and a packet of transfer papers bound with a red band. Mara took photos in 3 quick sweeps while backing toward the stairs. Above them, a door slammed. Then the bitter smell of fuel deepened all at once. "Move," Mara said. They came out hard into the wind just as a dark pickup, no front plate visible, lurched away from the lot's edge. Something shattered near the hatch opening behind them, followed by the thin rush of igniting liquid. Fire licked bright and ugly across old wood scraps and mesh. Not an inferno, just a fast, dirty burn meant to destroy paper before anyone could catalog it. Mara radioed the plate fragment she had caught. Lila kicked dirt against the flame, while Mara yanked aside the mesh to keep it from spreading deeper. Shep barked again and again, not panicked, but furious in the pure animal way that said danger had a scent, and that scent belonged to memory. Minutes later, with the worst of the fire stamped out and the first local unit pulling onto the lot, Lila stood in the hard wind with soot on her gloves and the rescued folder under her arm. She looked over the scar of land that had once held Caleb Dunn's porch, his workshop, his lilacs, his dog sleeping in the sun. He had not imagined it. He had not simply drowned in bitterness and invented enemies to make the bottle easier to justify. He had seen part of the machine turning. He had watched it use his family's land as a quiet throat through which dirty things could pass. Then shame, drink, and grief had buried the knowledge so deep that only a dog still faithful to the old map could lead anyone back to it. And standing there with Mara Quinn beside her and Shep trembling against her leg, Lila understood that Bay Point had not ruined Caleb because he was weak. It had ruined him because he had looked straight at the truth and been left alone with it. The morning after the fire at the old service cellar, the air over Merrow Bay felt sharpened, as if the whole town had been honed overnight into something that could cut. Lila Mercer stood in Deputy Mara Quinn's cramped office at the county substation while photocopies, photographs, and tagged evidence packets spread across the desk in careful rows. The rescued ledger from the cellar, the zoning amendments from Edith Rowe's archive box, Caleb's night photographs, and the data from the waterproofed USB no longer looked like scattered grief. Together they formed a structure. It was ugly, but it was real. Bay Point Renewal District had not simply taken land under the smiling banner of civic progress. It had become a corridor for hidden storage, unlisted shipments, suspicious transfers, and paperwork that changed purpose without changing public language. Lila had seen enough federal fraud cases to know the smell of one. It always began with polished wording and ended with ordinary people standing in the cold, wondering when their lives had become collateral. Mara, tall and spare in her tan uniform shirt, one copper-gray braid resting over her shoulder, slid a report across the desk. "I sent what we have to the regional task contact," she said. "If they move, they'll move on grant fraud, misuse of redevelopment funds, destruction of records, intimidation of witnesses. That's the clean version." Her narrow green eyes lifted to Lila's face. "The dirty version is that the same men who told this town they were saving it have been feeding off the bones." One name sat at the center of too many pages now: Warren Pike, former mayor, public champion of Bay Point, handshaking face of renewal. In photographs from a decade earlier, he wore expensive winter coats and that particular smile older American men sometimes cultivated when they wanted to look fatherly while making choices that broke families. Warren was 66 now, broad through the middle, his white hair brushed back in disciplined waves, his jaw still square beneath the softness of age. He had once owned a hardware chain before politics, and losing his youngest son in a boating accident 15 years earlier had deepened the public tenderness in his voice without softening his appetite for control. Grief had made him more skilled at looking humane, not more humane. His signatures, his approvals, and his private meetings threaded through Bay Point like nails under paint. Lila needed something the papers still could not give her. She needed a witness who had seen the movement with his own eyes, who could connect trucks to knights, knights to men, and men to land that should have been silent after seizure. She needed Caleb Dunn. By noon, she was back at Naomi Bell's clinic. Caleb sat in a chair near the rear exam room with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of water as if it were the only warm thing left in the world. He looked washed out and older than he had even 2 days before. His broad shoulders had not vanished, but they sagged under a private weather. His beard was trimmed unevenly now, probably by Naomi, with more mercy than style, and his blue eyes no longer carried as much haze. The shame in them, however, was clearer sober. Dr. Naomi Bell stood near the cabinets with her arms folded. At 43, solidly built and steady as oak, Naomi had a face that made animals calm down and liars speak shorter sentences. "He hasn't had a drink since last night," she told Lila. "That does not make him healed. It makes him shaky." Caleb gave a dry little laugh. "You say that like it's a hobby." "It's a condition," Naomi answered, "and conditions can be treated if the patient stops treating them like destiny." Shep was there too, resting on a folded blanket near the wall. His shoulder was healing, the bandage smaller now, but his amber eyes tracked every shift in Caleb's breathing. He was 5 years old and built for loyalty, with the broad sable coat of a proud house shepherd and the tired restraint of a creature who had learned to make himself small around sorrow. When Caleb looked at him, Shep did not wag. He did not shrink either. He simply watched. Lila sat opposite Caleb. "The evidence is enough to bring federal attention," she said, "but paper only goes so far. I need the person who took those photographs. I need the man who saw who came onto the property after it was supposed to be closed." Caleb rubbed his thumb along the rim of the cup. "And if I say no? Then Warren Pike and everyone under him get to keep telling your story for you." That landed. Caleb's jaw shifted once. "I'm tired," he said. Lila leaned forward. "So is your dog, and every time you shoved him away, every time you drank until you could not see what was left of your own soul, you helped them finish the job they started." Naomi went very still. Mara, who had arrived 5 minutes earlier and was standing at the doorway, said nothing. She knew truth sometimes sounded cruel before it sounded useful. Shep's metal water bowl tipped when his paw caught the edge, and it rang against the floor in one bright spinning note. The sound cut through the room like a bell in a winter church. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then Shep stepped slowly toward Caleb and stopped just out of reach. His ears forward, his body cautious, his eyes full of an old home neither of them could carry any more. Caleb broke first, not loudly, not dramatically. His shoulders folded inward, and he covered his eyes with one work-rough hand. I hated that he remembered it, he said into his palm. The porch, the workshop, the lilac bushes. I'd come out of that trailer, and he'd look at me like we could still go back if I just stood up straight enough. He swallowed hard. I wasn't angry at him. I was angry that he still believed in a man I couldn't find. No one rushed to comfort him. Mercy was in the room, but so was accountability. Naomi placed a form on the counter beside him. Temporary relinquishment, she said, for the dog, and a statement acknowledging neglect and unsafe conditions. Caleb stared at the paper for a long time. Then he signed. The sound of the pen moving seemed larger than it should have been. After that, he looked at Shep directly. I'm sorry, he said, voice low and stripped clean. I don't get to ask anything from you. I'm sorry I made home feel like a place to fear. Shep held his gaze, then stepped back half a pace. Not forgiveness, not yet. But he stayed. That evening, Caleb rode with Lila and Mara in Mara's county SUV to an abandoned bait shed near the lakeshore. The place had once belonged to Tom Arlen's cousin and now leaned into the wind like an old fisherman too stubborn to die. Beneath a loose plank under the counter, exactly where Caleb said Tom used to hide spare keys and cash, they found a sealed envelope and a flash drive wrapped in wax paper. The records inside were worse than Lila had hoped and better than she had feared. Transfer summaries, side agreements, coded payment tables, and one scanned memo tying Warren Pike's office to the investment group that had benefited from Bay Point's temporary logistics support services. It was enough to turn suspicion into direction. On the drive back, twilight spread blue over the frozen road that curved above the bay. Caleb sat in the rear seat with both hands clenched between his knees. He had grown quieter as the evidence became real. Not calmer, just more certain. Then headlights flared in the mirror behind them, too fast, too close. Mara muttered under her breath and tightened on the wheel. The vehicle stayed there, crowding them. Caleb twisted to look, panic rising off him like heat from wet pavement. That truck's been near the trailer before, he said. I've seen it. The shoulder narrowed ahead where the road edge had crumbled near the guardrail. Mara did not speed up. Stay still, she said. But Caleb, driven by old fear and new sobriety, reached for the door handle in blind instinct, as if escape could still be found by stepping out before danger fully arrived. Shep, braced in the cargo area behind the seats, exploded into a hard bark and lunged forward just enough to slam his body against the back of Caleb's shoulder. Caleb jerked inward on reflex. At that exact moment, the truck behind them swerved too close, its front tire spitting gravel where Caleb would have stepped. Silence hit the car like cold water. Mara drove on another quarter-mile before turning sharply into the lit forecourt of a gas station. The truck behind them kept going. Caleb sat trembling, one hand over his mouth. He looked at Shep through the gap between the seats. They know, he whispered. Lila turned toward him. Yes, she said, which means you're no longer a ruined man they can ignore. You're a witness. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded once, slow and frightened and fully awake. All right, he said. I'll testify. By nightfall, arrangements were moving. Temporary witness protection lodging in another county, statements, intake forms, quiet phone calls. Caleb stood outside Naomi's clinic one last moment before leaving, the winter wind lifting the frayed edge of his jacket. Shep waited beside Lila, close enough to feel, not close enough to lean. Caleb looked at the dog, then at Lila. Take care of him, he said. Lila answered with the only promise she was sure she could keep. I will. For the first time in years, Caleb was being taken somewhere safer than his own shame. And for the first time in longer than that, Shep was not being asked to carry the whole broken weight of one man's sorrow by himself. Spring did not come to Marrow Bay in a single brave gesture. It arrived carefully, like an old woman testing a porch step after a long winter. The snow had pulled back from the roads in thin, dirty ribbons, and the bay no longer wore a full coat of ice, only bright fragments drifting like broken mirrors near the shore. In the weeks after Caleb Dunn agreed to testify, the town changed in the way towns often do when truth becomes too heavy to keep under one roof. It did not grow kinder all at once. It grew quieter first. Men who had defended Bay Point in diner booths began clearing their throats before speaking. Women who had once said maybe the town had no other choice started looking longer at the empty waterfront when they drove past. The papers Lila Mercer, Mara Quinn, and the federal auditors assembled had done what grief alone could never do. They had made denial expensive. The full picture came together in layers, each one uglier than the last. Edith Rowe's archived notes matched the entries in Tom Arlen's duplicate ledger. The old photographs Caleb had taken on sleepless nights matched vehicle logs from the forgotten service cellar. The zoning changes, those harmless-looking lines about temporary logistics support, had opened the land just enough for closed storage, unlisted freight, and shell company billing. Grant money intended for waterfront recovery had moved through the hands of men who smiled in ribbon-cutting photographs and spoke in the soft language of civic sacrifice. At the center stood Warren Pike, his polished sorrow and practiced fatherliness now stripped down to ledger marks, permits, and private signatures. One by one, accounts were frozen, properties were reviewed. Quiet men in suits arrived from Lansing and Detroit and did what they always did after a scandal. They measured ruin with clipboards. Lila watched most of it from the edge rather than the center. That was appropriate. She had not come to Morro Bay to become the story. She had only refused to look away once the story found her. Still, some mornings she woke in her aunt's small guest room and had to remind herself that Shep had truly walked up to a cafe window and changed the direction of 6 lives at once. There were moments in the pale hour before dawn when the whole chain of it felt less like investigation than Providence wearing mud on its paws. Caleb spent those weeks in a temporary witness unit 2 counties over. He did not emerge transformed into one of those polished redemption stories people told in church newsletters. He emerged thinner, sober enough to feel things more sharply. His hands still shook when too much silence gathered around him. The hard lines in his face had not softened, but they had become more honest. Shame no longer ruled him by surprise. It walked beside him where he could see it. When the day came for his formal statement and testimony, Leela stood at the back of the county hearing room with Mara and Naomi Bell, while Caleb sat at the long table beneath fluorescent lights that made every face look weary and a little exposed. He wore a borrowed navy blazer over a white work shirt, buttoned too high at the neck, as if he still did not trust his own body not to come apart in public. His beard had been trimmed close. His dark hair lay flatter than usual, though a stubborn lock kept falling toward his brow. He was broad through the shoulders still, but there was no hiding how much the last years had taken out of him. Across the room, Warren Pike sat with 2 attorneys and the same carefully folded hands he had used in campaign photographs. He looked expensive and insulted, like a man forced to stand in weather beneath his status. Caleb looked like what weather actually did to a person. When he began to speak, his voice came rough and low, but it held. He described the house by the bay, the porch rail he had rebuilt with his father's tools, the lilacs his wife had planted. He described the notices, the meetings, the language that told him sacrifice for the town was noble while it carved his life into categories and compensation estimates. Then he described the nights after the seizure, when trucks moved over the land at hours no construction should have been happening. When lights flashed under tarp covers, when Tom Arlen began keeping duplicate records because neither of them trusted what Bay Point called legal anymore. Caleb did not dramatize. That made it stronger. He spoke as men do when they are too tired to decorate pain and too honest now to hide it. By the time he reached the part about losing the house, then losing the shape of himself afterward, half the room had lowered their eyes. A microphone at the clerk's table gave a sudden burst of feedback, sharp, metallic, almost like a cry through a wire, and the whole room flinched at once. For one suspended second, Caleb stopped speaking, the sound still hanging in the stale air. Then he lifted his chin, steadied his breath, and went on. And that small act, no louder than a man deciding not to sit down, felt larger than any speech Warren Pike had ever made. He was not a hero in that room. That was the truth of it. He was a man who had failed his dog, frightened his neighbors, hidden from his own reflection, and still found enough strength to tell the truth when it mattered. That was more useful than heroism. It was real. In the days that followed, the legal consequences began their slow official march. Bay Point was named publicly for what it had become, a development project wearing the costume of public benefit while serving private greed, hidden storage, and money that moved better in the dark. The townspeople of Morro Bay did not suddenly become innocent in the telling. Some had believed the promises because they were desperate for jobs. Some had stayed silent because Warren Pike had been powerful for too long. Some had watched Caleb unravel and decided for the comfort of their own conscience that ruin meant guilt. The town had not been evil. It had been divided, frightened, and eager for rescue. That, Lila thought, was how harm often entered decent places, wearing the smile of practical salvation. A month later, on a bright morning with the first thin promise of spring in the wind, Lila sat again at Harbor Pine Coffee by the same wide front window where Shep had first found her. The light was different now, clearer, less brittle. Shep lay beside her chair on a folded wool blanket Naomi had given him, his shoulder fully healed, his coat thickening back into handsome order. He was calmer now, though not careless. His amber eyes still tracked doorways and sudden movements, but the old flinch had faded. He looked like himself again, or at least the version of himself that had existed before fear became a habit. Mara, the young barista with the freckled face and straw-colored braid, brought Lila coffee without asking and set down a bowl of water for Shep, with the shy solemnity people used around creatures who had become local legend against their will. "He looks better," she said. "So do a lot of us," Lila answered. The door opened 20 minutes later, and Caleb stepped inside. He had been sober long enough now for the change to show around the edges. Not a miracle, not a rebirth, but a beginning. He wore a clean brown jacket over a gray Henley, and though he still held himself with caution, as if one wrong breath might send everything collapsing again, he no longer looked like a man drowning in plain sight. The beard was trimmed, the eyes, still shadowed, were clear. He did not search the room like someone claiming a right. He stood just inside the door like a man approaching sacred ground after having once set it on fire. Shep lifted his head. For one long moment, nothing moved. The café sounds softened around them, the hiss of steaming milk, a spoon striking ceramic, the low murmur of a couple near the pastry case. Shep looked at Caleb, then turned his head toward Lila. There it was again, that old question without words. Is this safe? Is this true? Is this now? Lila met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. Only then did Shep stand. He did not rush. He did not leap into reunion as if pain had no memory. He crossed the floor slowly, stopped a few feet from Caleb, and held there. Caleb's face changed in a way no courtroom could ever have forced. Hope, grief, love, regret. Everything passed through it like weather over water. He lowered one hand, palm open, but did not reach farther. "That's fair," he whispered. "You take your time." Shep stepped closer by a single measured pace. Later, the three of them drove out to the bay. The old Dunn parcel lay open to the wind, the ground patched with dull grass and early mud, the remains of winter still clinging in the shaded places. Nothing had been rebuilt. The earth there still looked interrupted, as if the land itself remembered what had been taken from it. Lila stood a little apart while Caleb looked over the place where his house had once stood. Shep remained near him now, not leaning, not forgiving everything, but near. The emptiness did not feel empty in the same way anymore. It still held loss. It still held insult. But it also held the first fragile shape of truth, named aloud. Caleb stared over the lot with both hands in his pockets, shoulders bent against the wind, but not against himself. "I can't get it back," he said at last. "No," Lila answered gently. He looked down at Shep, then out across the bay where broken ice drifted toward open water. Maybe that's not the same thing as having nothing left. It was not a grand line. That was why it mattered. Before the vacant land that had once been his home, Caleb Dunn stood beside the dog he had failed and the woman who had refused to let that failure be the end of him. He could not reclaim the past. But he could begin, step by step, to build something smaller and harder and truer in its place. Self-respect earned back the way injured animals relearn trust. Not all at once, not cleanly, but with patience, honesty, and the courage to stay. This story reminds us that not every ruin begins with a storm, and not every rescue arrives with sirens. Sometimes a life falls apart quietly, one loss at a time, until a man no longer recognizes himself in the mirror. Sometimes a faithful animal carries more truth in its wounded silence than a room full of powerful people. And sometimes the smallest act of mercy becomes the first stone in the road back home. The lesson is simple, but it asks a great deal of the heart. We must be careful what pain turns us into. Sorrow can bend a soul, but it must never be allowed to make us cruel to the innocent. When life takes our home, our work, our pride, or our peace, we still remain responsible for how we treat the gentle lives placed beside us. Animals trust us with a love that is pure, steady, and undeserved at times. To harm that trust is to darken our own spirit. To protect it is to keep something holy alive in this world. There is also a deeper truth here for everyday life. Many people around us are carrying losses we cannot see. A neighbor may look bitter, but beneath that bitterness may be grief. A tired man may seem distant, but perhaps he is standing in the ashes of something he once loved. A frightened animal on a roadside, a lonely person at work, an old friend who has gone quiet. These may be the very places where kindness matters most. We do not always get to change the whole world in one day. But we can feed one hungry creature. We can speak one gentle word. We can choose not to walk past suffering as if it belongs to someone else. And perhaps that is where the miracle begins. Not always in thunder, not always in bright signs across the sky. Sometimes God sends mercy in a quieter form. Sometimes He sends it on 4 tired legs to a window on a cold morning. Sometimes He allows 2 broken lives to meet at the exact moment one soul is ready to help and another soul is ready to be seen. Maybe that is how heaven still works among us, not by erasing pain, but by planting grace inside it. So let this story be a call to live better. Be softer where the world has grown hard. Be honest before bitterness poisons what is left of your heart. Love the animals in your care with patience and dignity. If you see suffering, do not laugh at it, ignore it, or explain it away. Stand still long enough to notice. Reach out while there is still time. And if you have wandered far from the person you once hoped to be, remember this. With truth, humility, and God's mercy, a soul can still begin again. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, or simply write Amen if you believe that love, truth, and mercy still matter. And if you want more stories about faith, healing, loyalty, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next journey. May God bless every person watching tonight. May He protect your home, strengthen your spirit, comfort your sorrows, and place kindness in your path. May He watch over the lonely, the weary, the forgotten, and every gentle creature that depends on human hands for love. And may He remind you in your ordinary daily life that even when the world feels cold, you are still seen, still guided, and never beyond His grace.